praise music, and today it is a full-blown emerging church, an emerging school. The Bible warns about another spirit. Paul said in 2 Corinthians 11 verse 4, "For if he that cometh preaches another Jesus, whom we have not preached, or if ye receive another spirit, which ye have not received, or another gospel, which ye have not accepted, ye might well bear with him." And because of the carnality of the church at Corinth, Paul was worried about them because he knew these dangers that existed already in the world 2,000 years ago. And just because somebody praises a spirit or speaks according to a spirit does not mean it is the Spirit of God. And just because someone talks about Jesus and praises Jesus and says they love Jesus does not mean it's the Jesus of the Bible. And just because someone says they're saved and they talk about a gospel does not mean it's the gospel of the Bible. And we are taught here to be very careful, and we're to be on the lookout against spiritual deception and the wiles of the devil. How can we discern the Spirit of God from a false spirit, another spirit? John said in chapter 16 verse 13 of his gospel, "Howbeit when he, the Spirit of truth, is come, he will guide you into all truth." When the Spirit of truth is come, he is the Spirit of truth, and he will guide you into all truth, and the Spirit is all about truth. And where you find the Spirit of God having liberty, the true Spirit of God, you will find truth exalted. The Spirit of God is also the Spirit of holiness and righteousness. Paul said in Ephesians 5 verse 9, "For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness and righteousness and truth." And so that is the true Spirit of God. But when we examine the contemporary worship movement, we see that it is another spirit. And I have 7 evidences of that. The spirit, the foreign spirit of contemporary worship music is seen in that, number one, it is the spirit of charismaticism. Secondly, it is the spirit of the Jesus people movement. Thirdly, it is the spirit of the latter rain. Fourthly, it is the spirit of the one world church. Fifthly, it is the spirit of the world. Sixthly, it is the spirit of homosexuality. And seventh, it is the spirit of the shack, which has taken the Christian world by storm in the last 3 years. But first of all, we see that contemporary worship music is another spirit because it is a spirit of charismaticism. Contemporary Christian music could be called charismatic Christian music. And it has always been intimately associated with the Pentecostal charismatic movement. The Pentecostal movement was born at the turn of the 20th century. Usually its birth is traced back to a mission on Azusa Street in California in the early 1900s. That mission was founded by William Seymour, 1906, and it is typically considered the birthplace of Pentecostalism. Pandemonium broke out there. There was no order to the services. Anyone could speak, man, woman, or child. There was great confusion, dancing, jumping, trances, jerking, shaking, shouting, laughing, quite hysterical. In fact, sometimes the police had to be called in to quiet things down. Shaking was a big part of that Pentecostal experience. From its earliest days, one man shook so violently that an ambulance was called. The man told the doctor, "Don't touch me, this is the power of God." The doctor replied, "If it's the power of God, he's giving you a devil of a shaking." And that has been the essence of the Pentecostal movement from its very inception. Spirit slaying was a large part of the experience. We read in one of the histories of that movement that at times people would fall all over the house like an army, slain on the battlefield. We don't read anything like that in the New Testament. In spite of their claim in the earliest days of Pentecostalism, that they had the special apostolic anointing, the mission went bankrupt. And the bank foreclosed on the property. They did not have a good testimony as far as finances goes. And in spite of the teaching about healing in the atonement, William Seymour died at age 52 and was in poor health long before that. And we know that people die at 52, they die at 42, they die at 32. But he was teaching that God promises healing and health in the gospel. And yet here he is, doesn't even live a normal life out. Azusa Street was very influential. They produced many of the early Pentecostal leaders in the Assemblies of God and other denominations. Then in the 1960s, the spirit of Pentecostalism became ecumenical and leaped into all the denominations. This began in 1960 with the outbreak of, quote, tongues at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Van Nuys, California. The movement spread to Lutherans, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, and others. And as much as anything, the charismatic movement is building the one world church. In 1967, the spirit of the charismatic movement swept into the Roman Catholic Church. By 1975, 20,000 Roman Catholic charismatics traveled to Rome to receive the blessing of Pope Paul VI. That charismatic spirit did not make these people leave the Catholic Church typically. It simply made them better Catholics, made them have a new love for Mary and for the Mass and for the papacy. For example, Cardinal Joseph Swinens, who was at the head of the Roman Catholic charismatic movement for a long time, said, "Since I have had this charismatic experience, my appreciation of the Mass as the sacrifice of Christ has been heightened." And so whatever spirit this was, it is not the spirit of truth and holiness and righteousness. By 2002, there were an estimated 119 million charismatic Roman Catholics in 230 countries. New Orleans 87 was attended by 40,000 professing Christians, charismatics, from 40 denominations, and there were 20,000 Roman Catholics there. Many priests and nuns were in attendance, and many of the speakers were priests and nuns. They had a Roman Catholic Mass every morning in the main area of the Superdome. The final speaker was priest Tom Forrest from Rome. He said in one of his messages that he thanks God for purgatory, because he said that's the only way he could go to heaven is through purgatory. Obviously, he doesn't believe in the sufficiency of the blood of Christ. The charismatic movement represents a foreign spirit. And the contemporary worship music is at the very heart and soul of the charismatic movement. The vast majority of the influential contemporary worship musicians are charismatic. We've documented this in a DVD series entitled Music for Good or Evil. We've documented this in the book Contemporary Christian Music, Questions Answered and Warnings Given. We've documented this in the free ebook entitled Directory of Contemporary Worship Musicians, which is available from the Way of Life website. And so our first warning and our first bit of evidence that contemporary worship music represents another spirit is the fact that it is the spirit of charismaticism, the charismatic movement. But secondly, contemporary worship music is the spirit of the Jesus movement. Contemporary praise music was born with the Jesus People movement of the 1970s. And I was not a part of the Jesus People movement, but I was a part of the hippie movement at that very time. After I returned from Vietnam, I was in Southern California in 1971, in 1972, and in 1973. Hitchhiking, using drugs, getting involved in Hinduism. I was there in that very place where the Jesus People movement was born, although I was never a part of it. The leader of the Jesus People movement was a man named Lonnie Frisbee, charismatic Jesus hippie. And he mesmerized Chuck Smith of Calvary Chapel when Chuck Smith met Lonnie Frisbee. At that time, Chuck Smith's church was a very small church, just a few dozen people at the most. But with the coming of Lonnie Frisbee into Chuck Smith's life, thousands of hippies began to be baptized and to come into that church. And the Calvary Chapel exploded. They kept their long hair. They kept their immodest clothes. They kept their rock and roll. They kept their sensual party type thinking even. Lonnie Frisbee was described like this: with his long brown hair, long craggly beard, dusty clothing, scent of Mary Jane, which is marijuana, and glint of the last LSD trip in his eyes, he showed up on Chuck Smith's doorstep. Chuck Smith's wife had a prophecy that God was going to use Frisbee in a great revival. And Frisbee was invited right away to lead a Wednesday evening Bible study, and the church began to explode at that time. Thousands of hippies were baptized in the Pacific Ocean. It made front page news in Time magazine, many other national, international magazines. And Frisbee's converts included the founders of the contemporary praise music, such as Love Song and Children of the Day. Here is Frisbee on the right hand of the photograph with Love Song, the members of Love Song, one of the very first contemporary praise groups. In the early 1970s, Calvary Chapel became the home of 10 or more of these musical groups, and they founded Maranatha Music to publish as the first publisher of contemporary praise music. Instead of renouncing their old music, which was filthy, which was godless, which was obviously of the devil, and that is something that God showed me soon after I was saved, that my old music was of the devil, of the world, the flesh, and the devil. Instead of renouncing that, they used rock and roll to create Christian rock, and they thumbed their noses at anyone who did not like it. And in those days, there were a bunch of churches that did not like it. But this attitude of rebellion, this attitude of don't tell me how to live, has always been part and parcel of the Christian rock movement. Larry Norman led the way in 1975 with his hit, "Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music?" He was defending rock and roll. The lyrics said, they say rock and roll is wrong. They say cut my hair. They're driving me insane. Just give me a song that has a beat. Just give me a song that moves my feet. I don't like none of those funeral marches. And so he's characterizing the old traditional hymns as funeral marches. And he says he wants something that would make him dance. That's the kind of music he was demanding. And that has always been the rock and roll philosophy. I will listen to whatever music I like. I'll dress as I please. No one's going to judge me. That's why they are enemies of every fundamentalist Bible-believing church. And they mock such churches continually. Steve Taylor wrote a song about being a clone, mocking a Bible-believing position. He said the church is an assembly line. I want to be a clone. I'm glad they shoved it down my throat. I want to be a clone. And another